won't make them, but it is really extraordinary how hard it is to figure out whether any carpet that you get actually they had any commitment whatsoever to avoiding child labor. So Guatemala, of these cases, I would say this is the group that I ended up with the most respect for. The people who work there are really committed. They're very serious human rights and labor activists who work there. As I said, they have strong contacts with transnational activists from the United States, which certainly gives them a little bit more independence in relationship to the companies that they work with. They can actually contact college groups and the Guatemalan Labor Education Group in Chicago. They know that they can get international attention for any conflicts that break out in any factories that they work on. But the Coverco staff are incredibly aware of how limited independent monitoring is, how dependent they are on the companies, particularly for access to subcontractors. They really have no way to go into those factories if the brand doesn't give them access. And at any time that the brand walks away from a subcontractor, they lose access to that factory and they really can't support worker struggles. I'm also struck by how strong the tensions are with Guatemala's labor movement, who argue that these NGOs, including Coverco, for all of their respect for the individuals who work there, have never really managed to put in any mechanisms that allow workers some control over the process of monitoring. Unionists argue that workers are the best monitors of the workplace. And by bringing in outside monitors, however well-intentioned and however clearly concerned they are about workers' rights, it's not the same as giving workers more power at work. And I think we really need to think about this in the fair trade movement. Coverco's made a shift to moving away from monitoring to increasingly trying to work with the Guatemalan Labor Department, as corrupt and problematic and under-resourced as it is, to try to enforce national labor laws, because they say, in the long run, they will do better creating national institutions for enforcing basic national laws than trying to use outside pressure through this kind of indirect process of the supply chain to support workers' rights. So they've become increasingly oriented towards training, using their experience monitoring factories to train local labor inspectors to try to help strengthen the Labor Department's commitment to and ability to monitor subcontracted factories. So this has led me to really think a lot about some of the assumptions that underlie the fair trade movement. And here, many of you will be familiar with this kind of simplified version of Mimi Keck and Catherine Sicking's human rights boomerang, in which local groups this is the top picture up there, local groups in a country with repressive governments send out information. They bear witness as victims to human rights violations. They send that information out to transnational networks. Those networks use that information to mobilize pressure from their own democratic states and from intergovernmental institutions to put pressure back on the repressive state to try to improve the way the state behaves towards local victims. In the shift over the last 15 years within the labor movement to thinking about what transnational labor campaigns would be like, I think we've kind of inadvertently tried to imitate this boomerang but left the state out completely. So instead of local groups, we have workers who send out information to NGOs who try to mobilize pressure from consumers on the brand, to put pressure on the subcontractor to improve their treatment of workers. It's a similar boomerang, but it leaves out the state. And it seems to me that we really should be thinking a little bit about how instead we could construct democratic mechanisms that would allow local workers to create their own codes of conduct, those are called national labor laws, and get them enforced through some kind of responsive. I don't have the answers here, so I'm not saying I know how transnational campaigns would do this, but it seems to me we need to think much more about how to use transnational campaigns to reconstruct or to help construct democratic institutions that allow workers greater voice over their own destiny, rather than having them rely on wealthy consumers on college campuses in the United States. It just seems to me that there's something about our end, not about, I think we should be mobilizing consumer pressure, but I think we should be thinking about what we're doing that for, and what the end is, and think about what those institutions might look like, rather than assuming that consumer pressure alone is going to actually change workers' long-term ability to speak for themselves. I want to end with my favorite social theorist, Polanyi, who said it way better than I did, which is that markets on their own have incredible destructive power. And he argued that you needed a counter-movement, which for him usually took the form of some kind of democratic state intervention in market forces that could protect communities and humans from the ravages of this satanic mill.
economists, of course, represent Satanic Mills, we know. Let's have questions, and hands up. I'd like to see some hands, somebody who's not spoken. Okay, there. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. What does CSR stand for? That's for Lichtenstein.
Sorry, yeah. I now the lingo. I didn't know this lingo. Corporate social responsibility. I'm sorry. I apologize because I didn't know any of this lingo 3 or 4 years ago, and you can see I've assimilated it. And corporate social responsibility is sort of things we've been talking about in the second presentation. That is codes of conduct that activists and corporations, activists pressure corporations to put into effect, and most of the major corporations have these codes of conduct, and there's a big critique of them, obviously. So I have to be a plain-spoken person, and none of the social science jargon, because I'm not a social scientist. So you got me. You got me. Well, sorry. Okay.
Next question or comment or whatever. Yes, ma'am.
I just some of you, although I thought it during Nate's talk. So in your first slide showing, the origins of the, three initiatives you studied, there was state-to-state pressure involved. But that state-to-state pressure was driven by activists. Now we've got all these corporate actors who are making some good faith efforts to clean up their act in a federal way, but they're finding it incredibly difficult to do so. Why aren't they going to their governments and saying, we want you to put pressure on any government, or Chinese government, or whatever?
In fact, why are they doing the absolute? Here's all these companies in China that are supposed to be, committed to improving workers' conditions, and yet when the Chinese government passes a law that allows independent unions, what do? They say it's going to screw up everything. Why indeed?
So I understand that why is it like? Or maybe they are doing it. I just don't know.
Scott, did you want to say something?
Yeah.
Would we have to respond?
Well, as I say, the big reason we visited the Yuyuan factory where Nike gets a lot of its shoes, and we were greeted with open arms and formality and wonderful banquets. Why? Because Nike it's a brand, very sensitive, and they were worried. 10 years they were worried about potential boycotts. We couldn't get into any Wal-Mart factories because Walmart, they simply are not worried about consumer boycotts. That's number one, and that's I think important. And they are not. Walmart itself is kind of a brand, but the individual products sold within it. And in fact, just to give me one story I had in here. When we're in the Nike factory, we're in the Yuyuan factory, which produces shoes for Nike, for Reebok, and for starter brands, which Walmart has. We talked to the production manager there, and he said, let's go over to the local Walmart. So we went over to the local Walmart, and there went to the shoe section right away, and there were all these shoes, these starter shoes, a brand I've never heard of, but I mean, it doesn't have the profile of Nike. And the production manager from the Yuyuan factory was just excoriating the quality of these shoes. And one of his main criticisms was, these shoes have no brand identity. That was him, not us. So it showed really that what that meant was a certain kind of leverage that Western consumers or NGOs or whatever didn't have. But I would like to hear your comment.
I think the distinction Nelsen made between brand and retailers is critically important. If you look at the way that power brands and retailers have behaved during this period of debate, a new debate about social shop conditions and forms of conduct, we see that the primary thing that motivates any of these corporations to change their behavior is the perception that their reputation is at risk. And as you noted, Nelsen, to the extent that a particular corporation, a retailer, to the extent that the brand reputation represents a smaller percentage of the overall value of the company than in the case of Nike,